Hey there, my name is James. Welcome to Game Stories, where we write games that tell stories. And in this episode, we are talking about a couple of pieces of game design theory that I think are pretty important to helping us figure out a framework for writing and designing game stories. The first of these is the MDA Framework approach. Just bring that up. MDA, a formal approach to game design and game research by Robin Hunicke, Mark LeBlanc, and Robert Zubek. Let me just get down to the meat of this thing and show you what I think they mean. You can see there's some diagrams going on here. There's sort of three boxes in each of these diagrams, and usually the arrows are going, can't figure out which way to point, from rules or mechanics over to systems or dynamics, and then to fun or aesthetics. Essentially, there's sort of the design work that you do that leads to some kind of interaction with that design work on the part of players, which then leads to an experience that players have with that piece of design. This is the framework, right? Let me just get in a little bit more detail here. It says mechanics describes the particular components of the game at the level of data representation and algorithms, which is a little bit of a heavy way of saying, you know, in a video game, the code, or in a board game, the rules and components. Or a role-playing game, like the books and the rules that are in those books and the dice and the character sheets and stuff like that, the stuff of the game that you've designed. Dynamics describes the runtime behavior of the mechanics acting on player inputs and each other's outputs over time, which again is another kind of heavy way of saying players are going to show up and interact with the stuff you've designed. They're going to play through the levels of Super Mario Brothers. They're going to work through the Dungeons and Dragons adventure. They're going to move their pieces around the Monopoly board, and different kinds of strategies and different kinds of systemic behaviors are going to kind of come out of that, right? And then this leads to aesthetics, which describes the desirable emotional responses evoked in the player when she interacts with a game system. Now, they say desirable emotional responses, and I think that's sort of a funny term because it depends on who's desiring what, right? But this basically refers to the experience players have, right? Which is, it might be frustration, it might be like, I can't beat this level, or it might be a sense of accomplishment, or it might be a sense of engagement and fascination, or even like sadness or pity or something. All kinds of different emotional responses can be evoked by game systems, okay? Now, this isn't a perfect model. It's not comprehensive in a number of ways. In particular, it sort of assumes this linear relationship between mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics, meaning that the player experience is essentially a result of the design work and the player's interaction with that design work, but it doesn't sort of account for a player's cultural experiences or history with other games or kind of awareness of other systems or maybe their own design work that they've done, all of which kind of acts as a lens and filters their experience with the game and their own kind of desires for playing, there's all kind of psychological and social stuff that goes into the aesthetic experience of gameplay, which is not accounted for by this model. And that's okay, right? Because this isn't meant to be the world's most comprehensive model of how games work. It's meant to be a handle for game designers and game theorists to think about this particular part of games, which is how the rules lead to behaviors, lead to experience for players, right? There's other stuff going on, but as designers, this is kind of an important thread to pay attention to because the rules are that's our jam, right? That's what we do. We craft these rule systems and then give them to players, hoping they interact with them in the right way so that they have the experience we want them to have. We can't really control their psychological state or all of their past cultural experiences. We should try to be sensitive to all those things and aware of them and maybe design in ways that sort of accommodate for all of that. But those levers are not in our control. The rules, all the levers there are in our control. So this is kind of something we need to be aware of. The other way that I'm not quite totally happy with this system is just the language that it uses. So I kind of rewrote it a little bit. Here, let me show you. I call, instead of mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics, I just call it rules, behavior, and experience, which to me is a little clearer and more straightforward, right? I'm going to write rules as a game designer. I might write them in text on a rule sheet for a board game or a card game or a role-playing game. Or I might write them in code, right, for a video game. But either way, I'm going to be writing, let me emphasize that, I'm going to be writing these rules. And those rules are going to lead to certain kinds of player behavior. If the players are following the rules or misunderstanding the rules, they're going to be doing certain things. And the things that they do are going to lead to their experience, right? This is a really important thing for me to kind of get because the kind of writing that's happening when you're writing / designing games is a particular kind of what I guess I'll call technical writing. It's sort of like instructional writing, right? It's or experience creation or user interface. There's different ways to talk about this, but it's all this kind of design work and writing work that goes into handing off to another person a text that is meant to guide their behavior. Just like, you know, the manual for how to operate some kind of piece of machinery is a piece of writing that's meant to guide behavior. So is a game. A game is that too. And the only way for us to figure out if our writing is working and if our design is working is to see what people do with it, right? We can't just feel good about the game and put it on a shelf. We have to put it out there and see what kinds of interaction it creates, right? And I emphasize writing here because sometimes, well, obviously because I'm teaching a writing class, sometimes people lose track of the writing that's happening, but writing is sort of at the basis of this entire process. All of the rules tweaking, all of the design work, it's all writing. And we can argue about whether or not writing code is still writing. I would say that it is, right? In which case, any kind of game that you're creating is all about putting some kind of symbolic language on a screen or on a piece of paper, and then hoping that whatever reads that symbolic language is going to do the right thing, right? Okay. This is important. Okay, so when you play test your designs, obviously it's a little bit different than the kinds of peer review you might be used to in the past. If you've been in English classes where you had to have, you know, other people in your class read your papers and give you feedback on it, you're basically handing them a text and then asking them what their experience of that text was, or were there any like obvious surface level flaws in the text, something like that. This is a little more advanced than that, or complex than that, in that you're not just going to ask the players and readers what their experience was. You're going to watch what they do, right? In the best kind of playtesting, sort of most advanced kind of playtesting, board gamers call it blind playtesting. You're going to hand somebody a rule set and a set of components, and you're going to walk away. You might not even be in the room. You might just have a video camera going. But you'll walk away. You won't answer any rules questions. You'll just give them the rule set. They have to read it, interpret it properly, and then do the game the right way. If they don't, right, if they make rule mistakes, and if you consistently see this with different groups, they're reading your rules and doing the wrong thing, then you have a real writing problem on your hands, and you need to revise your set of instructions so that the behavior comes out right. Watching that behavior is really like a fundamental thing, right? Once they're doing the right thing, though, once you can sort of hand somebody a rule set and they do the game the way that you want it to be done, then you're watching and asking them about their experience. Do they seem to be having a good time? Do you want them to be having a good time? Do they report the kinds of interactions and experiences that you were hoping would come out of this design or not? And if not, then you have a question, right? Which is, if enough players are reporting back to you that they're frustrated by some piece of their experience, then you probably want to go back and tweak the rules, not to get the behavior right, but to get the experience right. You want the rules to be different so that they can do different things that are more satisfying to them, right? And so this kind of writing is very interested and very engaged with the behavior of its audience and the experience of its audience. It's always attuned to what kind of experience am I hearing back and what kinds of behavior am I seeing back once I put this text in the world, right? Okay. All right, there's a couple more pieces of this kind of experience that are important when we talk about game stories, though. and not just games, right? And importantly, one part of an experience of a game is a narrative experience. You can play any game basically and have a story to tell about it. And some games, more than others, are designed to create this kind of experience. Game stories are games that are designed to create this kind of experience. When people come back out of the game and they've done the thing right, you want them to be saying, wow, this part of the story really intrigued me or fascinated me, right? That should be, it shouldn't maybe not the only piece that they're talking about, but that should be kind of a prominent thing that they're talking about. What else am I saying about this? Oh yeah, so narrative experience can be of two types, maybe more, but at least these two types. There's what I'm calling player story and in-game story. By player story, I mean like the story of what the players did. If a player comes to you and says, hey, yesterday I played this really cool game of chess. I moved my pawn out, they took the pawn, I moved my knight out. They checked it with their rook, and then I did this, and they did that, and I did that's a player story, right? It's a story about what they did in the game. The in-game story is a story that comes right out of the game itself. It's not, this is a little bit tricky. It's not necessarily a story of how player X and player Y interacted in the game or what they did. It's a story that is about inside the game world itself, let's put it that way, right? It's not I moved my knight out onto the board, it's the knight moved out onto the battlefield, right? If you really want to imagine sort of the thematic layer of chess, you're thinking about the knight took control of the battlefield but then was threatened by the opposing bishop or something, right? That would be the in-game story. Again, chess, not a great in-game story, probably better player stories, but there are designs that do better with that, right? An in-game story can be of two types. Maybe this has helped me clarify a little bit. It can be pre-written or it can be emergent. Pre-written in-game stories are like you as the designer have this pretty specific story you want to tell. It might branch, it might have different kind of angles that it wants to tell. But you've written it all, right? From beginning to end, characters, story arcs, character evolution, conflict, resolution, denouement, all that stuff is sort of baked in to the game already. And players come to the game text and sort of unravel that story as they play through it, whatever kind of game it is, whether it's board game, card game, video game. They're playing through this thing and unraveling your pre-written story as they go. It might even be kind of randomized or nonlinear. It might be a deck of cards that have different story elements in it, but you wrote it in advance, and they're uncovering it as they go. Emergent in-game story would be a story that you didn't write. You kind of created characters and put them in the world. You maybe even created a world for them to exist in and kind of limits on what they can do, but then they just started acting on their own and did a thing. Video game people, when they're talking about emergent story, are often talking about the interactions of artificial intelligence and the AI characters doing things and behaving in ways, or even having complex dialogue lines that sort of are responsive to anything that players might do. That's emergent storytelling. It's not something the designer sat down and wrote in advance. It's something that pops out during the play, right? And is the story of the characters in the game world. In like a role-playing game like Dungeons and Dragons, you might have a pre-written adventure. It might be a combination of these things. You might have a pre-written adventure that the dungeon master is guiding players through. But they also make choices that sort of go down divergent paths and even break the mold of the story in different ways, so that the dungeon master has to adapt and fill in places and redirect them and stuff, so that their version of that pre-written story emerges differently because of the choices that they make in play, spontaneously and improvisationally, right? So, is that the last thing? Yeah, that's the last thing. When we think about rules, behavior, and experience in game design, when we think about the kind of text that we structure to influence the actions and then experiences of our players, we want to make sure that players come out of their experience with some kind of in-game story to talk about, right? Like, story came out of the game that we played. Maybe it's just sort of a one and done. We went through it and I uncovered it all. Now I feel like I know the story. Or maybe it's a little bit more randomized or AI driven and they feel like they could go in again and have a different kind of story happen. But the story is a big feature of the experience of the game, right? The MDA framework has another limitation, which is that it doesn't really give us much at this level. It doesn't say what kinds of things should we be paying attention to in terms of our rule set in order to generate this kind of experience. So for that, we're going to turn to a tabletop role-playing game designer, Vincent Baker. Where did that go? Boop. Okay. Who wrote this article called How RPG Rules Work. And most of this is not really, this is getting it pretty advanced where there's like GIFs of flashing arrows and stuff, which is beyond what we need to know. Really, most of what we need to know is right up here. And there are these three elements in a role-playing game rules. There's the shared imaginative space, the fiction, he calls it. There's player interaction, players having some kind of conversation. And then there's the stuff of the game, the dice and the pencils and the paper and the character sheets and the rule sets, right? So there's rules and stuff, players talking to each other, and a shared imaginary world. And he sort of breaks down each kind of rule inside of a role-playing game to see whether it's like players interacting with fiction, like Dungeon Master says, there's a dragon, what do you do? Player then has to build on that imaginary world and say, well, I'm going to go chop it with a sword, right? And that's players, conversation, interacting with a shared imaginative space. There's also rules where the conversation is mostly about how to interact with the system. Dungeon Master says, roll a die to see how much damage you do. I got a 6, right? Did 6 damage. That's entirely player conversation about systems, and it's not translating into the fiction yet. But you also have rules that pull all three of these elements in together. You have rules where an imaginary event triggers some kind of rule system change that then tells the players to talk about something. Or players roll some dice, and then that triggers some kind of addition to the fictional world. Or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, until you have all these flashing GIFs of arrows that interchange, right? For me, it would have been enough just to draw these three things in a triangle and say, hey, in role-playing games, these three things are important. Whereas in board games, video games, maybe sometimes this is all that's important. Players interacting with rule systems. Some games are just pretty much dry like that, and there's not much imagination. In fact, in a comment down here, this is his model for how Monopoly works. There's players that do rule things and board things, roll dice, move the thing around, spend some money, lose some money, and then that system also tells players what to do. Roll a die, move 6 spaces. Okay, your turn, right? All right, I roll the die and I move 7 spaces, right? And then there's just sort of one arrow going out this way, meaning that each individual player might have a different kind of imaginary thing happening. Like, wow, I really am moving around through the world buying property, or here I go on the railroad or something. His comment is this: playing Monopoly, no arrows come rightward out of the fiction. In other words, the fictional world that you imagine is happening thematically in Monopoly never comes back at you and says, okay, well, if you're imagining you're on the railroad, then this, right? That wouldn't make sense in Monopoly. It says, imagine whatever you want, nobody else cares. Your version of the imaginary world of Monopoly doesn't ever interact with another player's imaginary world of Monopoly, right? And I think it's probably true in video games, but in role-playing games, this fiction and the shared fiction matters a lot, and it's kind of, in some cases, the whole point, right? Okay, but how do those tie in together? Because we're not just writing role-playing games, we're also writing all kinds of games that tell stories. And so what I want to draw from this is not just, hey, role-playing games do a better job of imagining things. What I want to draw from this is, hey, let's pay attention to what he's saying here about this puffy little cloud, right? Let's think about not just players and systems and player experiences, But let's think about how both of those things lead to and respond to imaginary worlds and imaginary stories and imaginary spaces that are generated through play. Okay? Because all the different kinds of games that we make that are story games are going to have this. And that is going to drive what players think and what they do and how they talk about it and how they interact with the systems of the game. Players will make decisions that might not be systemically optimal, but are most fictionally consistent, right? They might feel a certain way about the story and so make decisions based on that rather than grokking the rules of the game and making decisions based on that. So let's really pay attention to the theme and the story world generated in our games. We're going to find some important principles about game story design there. Okay. All right, so that's all the theoretical stuff I want to do, at least with these pieces. In brief recap, you're going to write some rules. You're going to write the rules. Writing is a big deal here. You're going to write some rules. Players are going to do stuff based on those rules. They're going to have some kind of experience, and we're going to try as best we can to make sure that that experience is a narrative experience that's not just, hey, I played this cool game, but is, wow, I played this cool game, and here's the story it told me. Here's the story that came out of that, right? That's what we're going for. All right, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.